in order to continue servicing even the initial debts of such a system, you're forced to borrow back into circulation what you're paying out of circulation, because the circulation disappears just in servicing the debt, and by the time that just the principal is paid. And yet you are forced to pay all the interest as well. Now, what happens then is you're perpetually borrowing principal back into circulation as new debt equal to the old, making it mathematically impossible to pay down any prior sum of debt. And you're paying interest out of the same circulation, borrowing that back into circulation as new debt above the former sum of debt. So the sum of debt increases, as I've said, at this perpetually escalating rate of ever greater sums of periodic interest on an ever greater sum of falsified debt, until we suffer inevitable terminal failure. And the reason that the failure is terminal is because once you reach the terminal sum of debt, you can no longer borrow further legitimately by any legitimate process, and just so long as you persist in a vital circulation, you can only increase the sum of debt beyond terminal extents. So this is why the present economies of the world, which is a lie of economy, they're not economies at all. In fact, they're the very antithesis of economy. They're instead processes which can only multiply falsified indebtedness upon us until we suffer, or costliness upon us is another way to conceive of that, and until we suffer terminal failure. So how do we fix all this is the question. And in order to fix all of it, we have to understand a further thing, which is a proof of three categoric faults. And I won't indulge in proving this because they're actually very self-evident facts. But I resolved that owing to this event which happened in my economics class in high school, that there were two categoric faults. The first was inflation and deflation, circulatory inflation and deflation, and the third, but second of the two, of course, the one that I usually give as the third, is inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of falsified indebtedness by interest. And I had to think for some while about all of the other possible, anomalies. But let's get these first two correct. First of all, circulatory inflation, which I prefer to distinguish it as, it was just said to be inflation at the time that I was taught economics. And circulatory inflation was supposed to cause price inflation, and when the teacher asserted this in the class, I raised my hand and immediately disproved that was possible off the top of my head, and that this escalation of falsified indebtedness by interest would be the cause instead of increasing prices. In fact, circulatory inflation doesn't even exist. There are even major presidential candidates of the United States who claim it's the cause of our problems. But by definition, inflation and deflation, respectively, are increases or decreases in circulation per goods and services, or represented wealth. I prefer to say represented property. So price inflation, as I proved, is caused by an increase in indebtedness in proportion to a circulation which dedicates ever more of the circulation to servicing the falsified sum of debt, which is increasing perpetually at an escalating rate, as I've just explained. And by the way, the models that I provided the Reagan administration, which in 1983 and 4 projected the present failure would transpire at approximately 2010 AD. All those models did was they paid principal and interest out of circulation and borrowed it back into circulation to maintain a circulation which was increasing at rates which we felt were in line with targeted results of government and the central banking systems of the world, which tells you itself that these two entities together, hand in hand, are what corrupt the economies of the world. A lot of people probably don't understand that here at the founding of the United States, for example, the greatest intellectual minds of the American Revolution stood against banking. It's possible our revolution was more or less fought over banking, actually, though, we hear the cry taxation without representation. We assume it was mostly about taxation because those are the events which are taught in schools and whatnot. But there was much cause, and probably by far the most prominent cause, by extension or expansion of banking into the colonies here as well. Now, some of that history is disputable, so I don't really generally raise those issues much. But just for example, there's a disputed quote of Thomas Jefferson in which he's supposed to have said, quote, "If the American people ever allow the banks to issue their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation," which is this process that I've described of introducing such a currency subject to interest, a falsified debt subject to interest, into circulation, having to pay interest and principal out of a circulation comprised only of some of the principal, and then, of course, having to borrow that back into circulation as new debt increased above the former sum of debt by so much as periodic interest on the former sum of debt, you can understand what the only thing that Jefferson could have meant if he in fact said this. So he says, if the American people ever allow the banks to issue their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations which will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. So, indeed, this is a very important principle for us to understand, and you have to wonder why Jefferson, didn't quite come up with a solution, but under the difficulties of the time, it just appears that even while solution might have been on the tip of their tongues or minds, it never quite happened. So let's go back to our three categoric faults so we can understand what is a solution. Our first categoric fault, as I originally conceived of it, was inflation and deflation, which is what we could call volumetric impropriety. In order for money to actually have an immutable value, it has to have a perpetual one-to-one relationship between the property it represents and the volume of currency. So every unit of currency represents so many units of a like unit of property. When that property expires, that unit of currency needs to go away as well. That's an important thing for us to understand here.
So,
But
sorry, just a quick one on that. So are you saying we should get rid of the banks? Say
oh,
bye-bye to them?
absolutely, they have to go, and they will go. They will go soon.
So, okay, I'm not going to go too deep into this, and I'm going to let you continue with what you're saying there in just a second. It's just, judging by what you've just said, to get rid of the banks, that's cool, no problem with that. They cost us all a lot of money. They're gone. But who's going to manage, or who's going to, let's say, control the infrastructure of this system?
We are. In effect, what mathematically perfected economy is a restoration of our right to issue promissory obligations. Now, the banking system really doesn't add any credibility to any of the processes of purportedly issuing credit, which it does not. The banking system is not a true creditor, as I've explained. They merely publish evidence of our own promissory obligations. We are the issuers of money. But I need to explain some of the background to that so that people can understand how simple the solution is, because in truth, all that's really happening is in this example that I gave where I issue you a promissory obligation for a house, for instance, the banking system has inserted itself into the equation for merely a piece of paper. They falsified my obligation to pay and retire principal from circulation into a falsified debt to the banking system, which keeps the principal, though it has no entitlement to it whatsoever, and then multiplies that into a terminal sum of debt. You understand that the first time the world was plunged into depression was a mere 15 years after the Federal Reserve System was created and became the world's reserve currency. The Federal Reserve Act promised to solve all the problems it can only cause, and in the whole of economics, the entirety of economics is entirely bereft of formal proof and theorem. It's nothing but a pseudoscience based upon this falsification of indebtedness and submission of those debts, falsified debts, to interest, which multiplies debt into terminal failure. So after 15 years after the Federal Reserve System was created by passing the Federal Reserve Act on the eve of December 23rd, 1913, and began operation the following year in 1914. 15 years later, we had the 1929 stock market crash, which plunged the world into 10 years of depression, gave rise to Adolf Hitler, etc., etc. And people believe that, World War II somehow resolved our monetary problems. That's not true at all. What allowed us to begin, in effect, a second lifespan of the system was merely that the parasitical banking system decided to renew everybody's creditworthiness, although it had been destroyed by this multiplication of falsified indebtedness into terminal indebtedness. So when you restore creditworthiness, which is permanently destroyed by this system itself, you're doing that merely to start over again, to loan people money, to buy property, to build houses, to develop industry, which multiplies indebtedness because the falsified indebtedness is subject to interest. So we just began a second lifespan of the same system, which under more moderate rates of interest has merely succeeded for a while longer to survive the multiplication of indebtedness, because interest, in effect, interest rates are the throttle for the rate of failure. The higher the rates of interest, the faster you fail, because you're paying more interest out of circulation and you're borrowing that back into circulation as new debt, but it's because it's a bigger sum of interest, a greater sum of interest, you're borrowing more interest back as new debt, increasing debt by a greater rate. Interest is the rate of failure, the very rate of failure. So yes, we need something to replace the banking system, but until I get to the end of this story, we won't know what that is. It makes little sense to discuss it because it seems like you're just, issuing whim. But this whole idea of mathematically perfected economy is actually predicated not only on absolute solution of each and every issue. It's also, from its very inception, it was a proof of singular solution. That is, nothing else solves our problems. And we have to understand that, or it's not even worthy to discuss it, I don't think, as an idea. Because at this juncture of history, the world has to wake to the fact that it has a solution. Your generation